This evening I'm going to speak about the fire falls because it has a very specific implication. So we start off speaking about Sodom and Gomorrah. The two angels came to Sodom that evening when Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. Lot saw them, got up to greet them, and prostrated himself on the ground. He said, "Here now, my lords, please come over to your servant's house, spend the night, wash your feet, get up early and go on your way." "No," they answered, "we will stay in the square." But he kept pressing them, so they went home with him, and he made them a meal, baking matzah for their supper, which they ate. So there are these two angels that come, and there were three angels that were actually on their way to Sodom, along with Abram. But only two came to Sodom, and when Lot saw them, he prostrated himself to the ground. So he actually knew that these were angels, and the reason that he must have known that is because he previously saw angels in Abram's presence, which I'm reasonably certain about is why he invited these angels to come to his house that evening and spend their night there, and then to go further. And they said that they would stay in the square, but he kept insisting, and then he invited them to his home, and he baked unleavened bread or matzah for their supper, which they ate. Now, unleavened bread has two implications. It has a corporate implication, and the corporate implication is that unleavened bread means that there is nothing added and there is nothing that puffs up. And it also has a personal implication, and the personal implication also is that there is nothing added, which means there is no sin and no unrighteousness, and that it is not puffed up or proud. Because the most important thing for all believers is not to be proud or to be arrogant. And they ate there that evening. They called Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to stay with you tonight? Bring them out to us. We want to have sex with them." Lot went out to them and stood in the doorway, closing the door behind him, and said, "Please, my brothers, don't do such a wicked thing. Look here, I have two daughters who are virgins. Please let me bring them out to you, and you can do with them what seems good to you, but don't do anything to these men, since they are guests in my house." "Stand back," they replied. "This guy came to live here, and now he's decided to play judge, for we'll deal worse with you than with them." Then they crowded in on Lot in order to get close enough to break down the door. But the men inside reached out their hands, brought Lot into the house to them, and shut the door. So Lot tried to prevent these men from coming in and sodomizing the angels. So Lot went out and stood in the doorway, closing the door. And they said, "Please do not do such a wicked thing." And because he knew that these were angels and that should not happen with them. And then he said that he would bring out his two daughters in their stead so that they could do what they liked. So Lot clearly had forgotten what is righteous and was prepared to sacrifice his daughters for these men. They said, "Do not have anything to do with these men," because he knew who they were, and they were trying to sodomize these two men. And he thought that he could prevent damage to these two men. But the men inside reached out their hands, brought Lot into the house, and shut the door. So the men inside, the angels, prevented anything bad from happening to the daughters who were virgins, and also prevented anything further from happening. This actually meant that Lot, even though he knew that these things should not happen to his daughters, was prepared to send them out. He also calls the people who are outside his brothers. So he had so mingled into them that he considered them to be his brothers. So he was actually so unequally yoked with the people in Sodom that he was prepared to give his daughters to them. But the men inside reached out and they shut their door behind him, and thereby they very clearly indicated that Lot was not doing as he was supposed to do. When the morning came, the angels told Lot to hurry. Get up, they said, and take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, otherwise you will be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he dallied, so the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hands, and the hands of his 2 daughters. Yudhevavhe was being merciful to him and led them, leaving them outside the city. When they had brought them out, they said, flee for your life, don't look behind you, and don't stop anywhere in the plain, but escape to the hills, otherwise you will be swept away. So Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters were saved by the angels so that they would not land in the same judgment as the rest of Sodom. A thing was happening here that by the time Lot had come to Tzoar, small town, the sun had risen over the land. When Yudhevavhe caused sulfur and fire to rain down about Sodom and Gomorrah from Judea out of the sky, he overthrew those cities, the entire plain, all the inhabitants of the city, and everything growing on the ground. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a column of salt. Sulfur and fire rained down upon Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord had been speaking to Abram because of the sin in Sodom. And what happens here is Lot is dragged out of Sodom, and then the 2 cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, then are rained upon with fire. So this fire comes down on Sodom and Gomorrah because of the sin that was in them. Sin calls fire, and the fire from the Lord then destroys the sin. And in this place, the sin is so great that God destroys everyone, but he saves the guy who is semi-righteous, who is Lot. Lot had not been able to bring the gospel into Sodom, and he had tried because the people in Sodom said that he had tried to lord it over them. And in that very statement is the statement that is opposite from that which he said of Abram, because the Lord said of Abram, should I hide these things that I'm going to do to Sodom and Gomorrah from Abram? No, certainly not, because he is able to instruct those with him to follow me. So Lot was not able to instruct those around him because he had actually joined them in their unrighteousness for the purpose of making money, but he lived a private righteous life. And this was terrible to the Lord. So what Lot had built, his entire riches and everything that was around him was tested with fire, as Shaul or Paul said that it would. And the test with fire had destroyed all the wood, the hay, and the stubbles that he had created, and it destroyed that completely. His wife was so enamored with that life of sin that she looked back and she hankered back to that life of sin, and she became a column of salt. We need to just have a look at what she became. She became a column of salt. The Lord actually said that we are to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. But turning her into a column of salt, she became salt and could not be the metaphysical salt that she was meant to be. And in a certain way, she was thrown out to be trodden upon because she was not the salt that she was meant to be.
Yes, what made Lot to be semi-righteous?
Well, Lot was brought out of Ur of the Chaldees along with Abram. And Abram would not have brought him with him if he was not a righteous man. So Lot came all the way into Canaan along with Abram, because at that stage there was no talk of Canaan being called Israel. And then Lot's servants picked up a fight with Abram's servants, and then the Lord told him to choose. He chose to have the better portion of, so he actually chose for the area at the Dead Sea. Now, at the Dead Sea, where Lot chose to go, was on the other side of the mountains, where Masada is, and he went into those valleys there, and he lived there with the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, whilst Abraham withdrew from him and he lived in Israel. So Lot had chosen what was better, and he paid the price for it.
Is there anything called the semi-righteous?
Well, he was semi-righteous because the reason I'm using that terminology is there is no such thing. But he was living a private life of righteousness in his house. But his righteousness that he was teaching in his house was of a nature that when he spoke to his sons-in-law and told them that they should come out with them, the sons-in-law actually laughed at him. So no, there is no such thing. There is no such thing at all. But the important thing about Lot is that he had a private life and he had a public life. And his public life was not the same as his private life. Because if his public life was the same, he would have convinced the people in Sodom and they would not have been stricken by fire. The next place that fire plays a very important role is at the burning bush. Moshe was tending the sheep of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and leading the flock to the far side of the desert, he came to the mountain of Elohim to Horeb. The angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh appeared to him in a fire blazing from the middle of the bush. He looked and saw that although the bush was flaming with fire, yet the bush was not being burned up. Moshe said, I'm going to go over and see this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't being burnt up. When Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh saw that he had gone over to see, Elohim called to him from the middle of the bush. Moshe, Moshe, he answered, here I am, he said. Don't come any closer. Take your sandals off your feet, because the place where you are standing is holy ground. So Moses was tending the sheep, and he obviously was always looking for better meadows for the sheep. And then he saw this burning bush. This is totally different from Sodom and Gomorrah, because Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by the fire. But this fire in the bush was a flame in the bush, but the bush was not being burned up. So this tends to indicate that there was something that was sinless in this bush. And for that reason, Moses went closer. Moses understood sinlessness because it is said of his father-in-law, Jethro, that he was Reuel. And Reuel means that he was a friend of Elohim. So as a friend of Elohim, he knew how to hear the voice, to obey it, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And he taught Moses, who was actually a prince of Egypt who now had to run away, how to live this life. And then Moses, having lived this life, came to see this burning bush. And he said, I'm going to go over and see this amazing sight and see why it isn't being burnt up. But the angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh appeared in the blazing bush. Now, the angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, you will see that from the bush, Elohim called to him from the middle of the bush. This meant that the angel in the bush was Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and that the angel in the bush, being Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, also was visible. And because it was visible and in the bush, it means that it could not have been the Father, because when Yeshua says, no one has seen the Father, who has seen the Son has seen the Father. So this angel in the bush then was Yeshua in person, and he called to Moses from the middle of the bush, and he says, Moshe, Moshe. So Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, I am, calls to Moshe, and Moshe says, here I am. So the creature answers the Creator, saying, here I am, whilst the Creator is, I am. And he says, don't come any closer. And he says, take your sandals off your feet, because where you are standing is holy ground. Why did Moses need to take off his sandals? He was on holy ground, but he needed to come into contact with that holy ground. Now, this fire that is not consuming the bush is totally holy. There is no sin in him, and there is only sinlessness in him. So this fire that is in the burning bush calls Moses to come across. Now, this actually, you know the rest of the story as it actually develops, with the Lord then speaking to Moses. And when Moses says, "Who should I say this is?" he says, "Heyeh asher heyeh, I am that I am." And then later on he says, "I am." So again, the Lord himself is calling himself by the same "I am" that Moses says, "I am," excepting that the "I am" that Moses is using here is, he says "ani," whilst the Lord says "heyeh." So these two are totally different. Later on, when the temple guards actually come into contact with Yeshua, they say, "Are you Yeshua?" And he says, "I am," and they fall. So he could not have said "ani," because "ani" would not have caused them to fall to their faces. They could only have fallen to their faces if he said "heyeh," because that would have been "heyeh asher heyeh," whereby he was actually saying, "I am the one who appeared to Moses," and that is why the temple guards fell to their faces and probably were not able to arrest him, but he then delivered himself into their hands.
This metaphor, I don't know if I am correct, if I can say the metaphor to me.
Yeah.
I am.
Yeah.
When Moshe responded to his creator, "Here I am,"
Yes.
he did not know then that he's talking to the "I am." Was he responding because he knew that Abba is "I am," or was he responding because he was just making a statement, "Here I am," and then later the Creator said, "I am"?
That is exactly, because he says, "Here I am." But when the Creator then speaks to him, the Creator says, "Heyeh asher heyeh." The word "heyeh" is the base word for the name Yud He Vav He. So you see, when Yeshua comes and the temple guards fall, he must have said to them, "Heyeh." He might even have said to them, "Heyeh asher heyeh," I am that I am. As temple guards, and because they were fluent in Hebrew, and the temple guards were Jews, they actually knew from their studies that Heyeh asher heyeh means that he is the angel who appeared in the bush. And this is hugely important in understanding this, because then comes the whole issue of taking the sandals off his feet. Then, when the Torah was received on Sinai for the first time, when Moses went up the first time to get the 2 tablets, on the morning of the 3rd day, there was thunder, lightning, and a thick cloud on the mountain. The 3rd day is an important day, because the 3rd day is the day of the resurrection. There was thunder, there was lightning, and a thick cloud on the mountain. One needs to remember that all of Scripture is integrated into one. And when we look at the Torah, Yeshua says, "The Torah is about me." When he speaks about the entire law, speaks about him. So on the morning of the 3rd day, the day of resurrection. And why the day of resurrection? Because what Yeshua's resurrection is about is Paul says in Romans 6, do you not know that all of you who were immersed into the Messiah Yeshua, so into his death, which is dying to sin, have died to their own sin so that they will be resurrected to new life as he was resurrected to new life. When the third day comes about, this has to do with resurrection to new life. When the Lord gives them the Torah, the purpose is that they will know what sin is, that they will stop sinning, and that they will be resurrected to new life, which is righteousness. And there was thunder, and there was lightning, and a thick cloud on the mountain. So it's important to see this thunder and lightning, because obviously with the thick cloud, because the thick cloud also, as we've discussed before, has everything to do with the fact that the thick cloud represents the talit of the Jews under which they get married, because this is the marriage ceremony of the Lord with Israel. Then a shofar blast sounded so loudly that all the people in the camp trembled. Moshe brought the people out of the camp to meet Elohim. They stood near the base of the mountain, and Mount Sinai was enveloped in smoke, because Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh descended on it in fire. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh comes again as fire, and its smoke went up like the smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain shook violently. The other place where smoke from a furnace appears is when the Lord moves between the two halves of the animals that Abram had divided, because there is talk of a furnace or a pot, and that furnace and that flaming torch that moved in between those two parts was the covenant of the Lord with Abram, when he said that your descendants would inherit the land. So this furnace actually is counting back to that furnace that actually eventually will lead Israel into the land. And the sound of the shofar grew louder and louder. Moshe spoke, and Elohim answered him with a voice. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh came down onto Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and then Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh called Moshe to the top of the mountain, and Moshe went up. There is thunder, there is lightning, there is a cloud, there is fire on the mountain when Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh descends onto the mountain to give the Torah to Moshe the first time. Moshe went up onto the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain, and the glory of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh stayed on the mountain. Just watch this whole thing of the fire appears and the glory of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh comes, because you will see it again with the inauguration of the temple. You will see it with the inauguration of the tabernacle. In Moses' case, again, in the case of David, I'm not specifically going to speak about it, but you will see that there again. And the cloud covered it for 6 days. Why for 6 days? Because 6 is the number of man, and the cloud covers man for 6 days, which is again God marrying man on that day, according to the rabbinic interpretations of what this happened. And on the seventh day, he called to Moshe out of the cloud to the people of Israel. The glory of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh looked like a raging fire on the top of the mountain, and Moshe entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, and he was on the mountain 40 days and nights. Now here you can understand why this was so scary to the Israelites. They had actually seen Moshe going up onto the mountain, into the cloud, and it looked like a raging fire to them. So how could Moshe possibly have survived this? This was the whole thing of Moshe disappearing into the fire that was on the top of the mountain. And it's important to see that the reason why Moshe was not consumed by this fire into which he entered was because he was actually dying into Yeshua, and he was dying to his sin, and his own unrighteousness to be in the presence of God, because he could not possibly have gone up there in sin and in unrighteousness. The second time he went up onto the mountain, the Lord said to him, "Be ready by morning. In the morning you are to ascend Mount Sinai and present yourself to me on the top of the mountain. No one is to come up with you, and no one is to be seen anywhere on the mountain. Don't even let the flocks or herds feed in front of this mountain." And Moshe cut 2 stone tablets like the first. The first 2 the Lord had cut. Then he got up early in the morning, and with the 2 stone tablets in his hands, he ascended Mount Sinai as Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh had ordered him to do. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh descended in the cloud, stood there with him there, and pronounced the name of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. So here he was saying his name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, which is akin to Yeh, Asher Yeh, I am that I am, and he pronounced that name of him to Israel as he had to Moshe when he saw him the first time on in the burning bush. Here is fire again, the fire of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the fire in the bush, which was not burnt up because there was no sin. And then an interesting thing happens to Moses there. The Lord says to him to throw his staff on the ground, and his staff becomes a snake. Moses' staff was his character, because in the ancient days people carved their whole history onto the staff, and therefore, by manner of speaking, it was his character. He threw down his character became a snake, and the Lord says to him, "Take it by its tail," which is the most dangerous part of a snake, to grab it by, and it became a staff again. So Moses did that one time again to show Aaron, but thereafter his staff never changed into a snake again, because his sinlessness had been absorbed by the Lord, and he had been put into a place where he could be sinless and righteous, and that is why he could stand before Pharaoh.
John the Baptist was saying that I'm baptizing with water, but then now they come the one that is greater than me, that will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. When today we're reading about that and the fire, it reminds me that John the Baptist was actually saying that Jesus Christ will be coming, telling us about. This fire. I think it represents Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. It represents God Himself. That He will be coming after me, and then He will be telling you exactly what actually God wants out of us. I think
He will burn away our sin and our unrighteousness. Yes, this is exactly what he was alluding to, because he will come with the Holy Spirit, and the role of the Holy Spirit is to burn away sin and unrighteousness, because we cannot get rid of our own sin and our own unrighteousness. Yes. Then the cloud in Exodus 40, at the inauguration of the tabernacle, the cloud covered the tent of the meeting, and the glory of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh filled the tabernacle. Moshe was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud remained on it, and the glory of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh filled the tabernacle. Whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel continued with their travels. But if the cloud was not taken up, they did not travel onward till the day when it was taken up. For the cloud of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh was above the tabernacle during the day, and fire was in the cloud at night, so that all the house of Israel could see it throughout all their travels. The cloud is the presence of God, but the presence of God was a fire at night, so that they could see. And this, again, is the whole concept, that he's a fire that comes into the tabernacle and that lives in the tabernacle. And that means that he is not to be played with, because he is this fire. Moshe told Aaron, "Approach the altar offer your sin offering and burnt offering, and make atonement for yourself and the people. Then present the offering of the people and make atonement for them, as Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh ordered. So Aaron approached the altar and slaughtered the calf of the sin offering, which was for himself. The sons of Aaron presented the blood to him, and he dipped his fingers in the blood and put it on the horns of the altar, and he poured out the blood at the base of the altar. But the fat and the kidneys and the covering of the liver of the sin offering he made go up in smoke on the altar, as Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh had ordered Moshe. The meat and the skin were burned up completely outside the camp. You will see something that is repetitive about this. And the thing is that at the inauguration of the temple, the sacrifices that are brought here are exactly the sacrifices of Yom Kippur, because there is a bull for a sin offering for Aaron and a bull for a burnt offering for him. This is a young bull that is slaughtered. The rest of the sin offering is burnt outside the camp, as is appropriate for Aaron as the high priest. So at the inauguration of the tent of the meeting, this is then done. Next, he slaughtered the burnt offering, and this burnt offering is the burnt offering for the people, and it also is a bull. And then comes the goat, which is the sin offering, which was for the people. And again, this goat for the sin offering is the goat of the sin offering, that is the goat for Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, that is sacrificed on Yom Kippur. And the burnt offering was presented, and he offered it in a prescribed manner. This burnt offering is the burnt offering for the nation. And then the grain offering was presented. And now, as far as this grain offering is concerned, I will just have to ask you to please believe me, but this grain offering is unleavened, and a handful of it is taken and it is burnt. It is sacrificed along with the burnt offering, and this grain offering is actually Yeshua dedicated himself completely, because he said that he was unleavened bread, and it went up in addition to the morning's burnt offering. Then he slaughtered the ox and the ram, and the people sacrificed as peace offerings. And Aaron's sons brought him the blood, which he splashed on all sides against the altar. But this ox and the ram that is brought as peace offerings, again, is reminiscent of the ram that is the peace offering of Passover. So you have all of these offerings come together, Passover and also Yom Kippur offerings, all brought at the inauguration of the temple. And then Aaron raised his hands towards the people, blessed them, and came down from offering the sin offering and burnt offering and the peace offering. And Moshe and Aaron entered the tent of meeting, came out and blessed the people. Then the glory of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh appeared to all the people, and fire came forth from the presence of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, consuming the burnt offering and the fat on the altar. When all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces. This means that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh came and consumed the burnt offering and the fat on the altar. The fire that first lit the altar came from Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and that burnt the offering. So once more, this is an image of God himself coming and burning away the sacrifices and the fat. And that is why they then fall flat on their faces, because God comes to consume the sin. Why am I saying God consumes the sin when he is consuming the flesh of the offering, because all offerings in Israel were brought in this way. Whoever brought the offering placed his hands on the head of that animal, and then he transferred his sin onto the head of that animal. And when he had, and even for the burnt offering, because all unconfessed sin and all involuntary sin was confessed onto the burnt offering, and then that animal became as the one bringing the offering, and that person slaughtered the animal. So in the case of the priesthood and in the case of the nation, the sin of the nation and the sin of the priesthood came onto that animal, and it was killed by the priest, who then took this blood and brought it as the proof that the sin had been brought, and that flesh was put onto the altar, which was the flesh of the animal who had died in the place of the nation or of the priesthood, and then the fire fell and consumed that flesh. So once more, God comes to consume the flesh. Now Korach, the son of Yitzchak, the son of Khat, the son of Levi, along with Datan and Aviram, the sons of Eliav and On, the son of Pelet, descendants of Reuben, took men and rebelled against Moshe. Siding with them were 250 men of Israel, leaders of the community, key members of the council, men of reputation. They assembled themselves against Moshe and Aaron and said to them, "You take too much on yourselves. After all, the entire community is holy, every one of them, and Yudai-Vavai is among them. So why do you lift yourselves up above Yudai-Vavai's assembly?" It is said of Moshe that he was the meekest of those who lived, but his meekness still brought Israel out of Egypt, and therefore it does not mean that he was a pushover. It means that he knew exactly who he was in Yudai-Vavai and never defended himself. And here you will see what happens when he does not defend himself. He takes this to Yudai-Vavai, and the next thing that happens, when Moshe heard this, he fell on his face, because he actually knew that these people were taking on Yudai-Vavai and not them. Then he said to Korach and his whole group, "In the morning, Yudai-Vavai will show who are his and who is the holy person he will allow to approach him. Yes, he will bring whomever he chooses near to himself. Do this, take censers, Korach and all your group, put fire in them and put incense in them before Yudai-Vavai tomorrow. The one whom Yudai-Vavai chooses will be the one who is holy. It is you, you sons of Levi, who are taking too much on yourselves." When Aaron has to approach into the presence of Yudai-Vavai, he is to bring censers with fire that comes from the altar. And here he's telling these people to put fire on the censers. In other words, this fire that comes onto the censers is not fire that comes from the altar. This fire that comes onto the censers is fire that they put onto the censers, and then they have to put incense onto them. Now the fire that goes off the altar also is used on the altar for burnt incense, to bring incense there, and that, in terms of what is written in the book of Revelations, is the prayers of the holy ones. So they're bringing false fire before Yudai-Vavai by doing this. And Yudai-Vavai is actually ordering to do that. And he's saying that by doing this, you will then put yourself in a position where Yudai-Vavai will illustrate who is allowed to come close to him. Then each man took his fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it, and stood at the entrance to the tent of meeting with Moshe and Aaron. Korach assembled all the group who were against them at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Then the glory of Yudevave appeared to the whole assembly, and Yudevave said to Moshe and Aaron, "Separate yourselves from this assembly. I am going to destroy them right now." So here in the presence of Yudevave and with these guys with a strange fire on the censers, and in the presence of Korach, he says, "I will now do what I will do." And the moment he finished speaking, the ground under them split apart, the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households, all the people who had sided with Korach and everything they owned. So they and everything they owned went down alive into Sheol. The earth closed over them, and their existence in the community ceased. All Israel around them fled at their shouting, "The earth might swallow us up too." And then the fire came out from Yudevave and destroyed the 250 men who had offered the incense. So these are the 250 who had presented themselves to Yudevave, were destroyed by fire, and Korach was swallowed by the ground. So you see, there are two ways in which sin is actually dealt with. Then the flesh of the burnt offerings is actually consumed by the fire of the altar, but the flesh of the sin offerings of the nations and of the leaders is eaten by the priests. So here Korach and everything with them is actually eaten by the earth. As sin is eaten, the flesh is eaten by Aaron and his male offspring. The forbidden goods that were taken at Ai. Yudevave said to Joshua, "Stand up. Why are you lying there face down? Israel has sinned. Yes, they have violated my covenant which I commanded them. They have taken some of what was to have been set aside for destruction. They have stolen it, lied about it, and put it with their own things. This is why the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their backs on their enemies because they have come under a curse. I won't be with you anymore unless you destroy the things meant for destruction that you have with you. So get up, consecrate the people, and say, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow. For here is what Yudevave, the Elohim of Israel, says. Israel, you have things under the curse of destruction among you, and you will not be able to stand before your enemies until you remove the things that were to have been destroyed from among you. So at this stage, it is still a bit of a secret what has happened. But immediately there is sin and things that have been stolen that should have been destroyed amongst them.
Verse 12 says, "This is why the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their backs on their enemies because they have come under a curse." Now, this to come under a curse is something that is still alive in our society, in our world of today. To the extent that in certain cultures, you can actually go and pay to get a curse cast or spoken over someone. Now, what I'm wondering about is this: they have come under a curse. I don't read that this curse originates from Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. On the other hand, where would this curse now have come from?
You know about the two mountains, the mountain of the curse and the mountain of the blessing. And they're interesting because the one mountain is a beautiful green mountain and the other mountain is covered with rocks. So there is the blessing and the curse. And you actually know the one mountain, the blessing, the mountain of the blessing is the mountain for Yudevave, because that is where the altar was. The other mountain is the mountain of the curse. So by doing this, you have actually chosen for the curse. And the minute you choose for the curse is because you choose you choose for sin. and you don't choose for Yudevave. Because these are the two mountains, they are Gerizim and Ebal. When there is sin in the camp and we do not remove it, we are unequally yoked, and what is supposed to come to those people comes to everyone. And therefore that first has to be removed. And this is exactly the same thing that actually Paul alludes to when he says that they have to remove the evil man from amongst them, the man who slept with his father's wife.
There's basically one man here that was disobedient and that sinned.
Yes.
But first of all, Abba lets a whole number of the Israelites die because of this. And then in this section that you read here, he does not speak of one man that needs to be punished. He speaks of the collective, the whole nation. Now, sorry that I say this and you can hear me hesitate, but how is that fair?
It has nothing to do with what is fair. It has to do with the fact that Cain's sin was that he was not his brother's keeper. In a war, when someone is taking loot, someone had to see it. Someone knew that this was happening. And the minute he took that loot, the guy or the guys who saw him should have reported it. And it is sin if you are a witness and you do not come to the fore. They should have spoken to him in the first place so that he did not take it. They did not do that. If he still insisted, they should have taken witnesses with them in terms of Matthew 18, because that's also based on the Torah. They should have taken people with them and told him, listen, stop this. And then if he had not listened, they and the witnesses should have taken that to the leadership of Israel, in other words, to Joshua, because if it had happened that it had been reported, then even Achan would have been saved. So this is our duty when we see this happening.
As I'm listening, I realize there was no possibility that anybody else had actually stolen anything, because Abba would have pointed it out.
Yes.
He only identifies this one person.
Yes.
And yet, as you say, there must have been those that witnessed and therefore participated in his theft, even though they didn't physically take it. And for me, this is, you can hear me struggling to find words, because if I try and apply it on my life and my world of today and how I act every day, then I almost don't even want to think about it, because there is so much happening and so much things that one actually sees. But I think what I would like to say is we do have to understand that this is about the tribe of Israel. It's the nation of Israel that's being punished for what one man did and what the others kept quiet about. It's not as though they've been punished for the sins of the whole world.
Yes. It's true.
And that is something that I should then carefully cope with for myself. That which is in my family and which I observe and keep quiet about, my whole family might get punished.
Therefore, tomorrow morning you are to come forward one tribe at a time. The tribe Yudevave takes is to come forward one family at a time. The family Yudevave takes is to come forward one household at a time. And the household Yudevave takes is to come forward one person at a time. The person who is caught with things in his possession that were reserved for destruction is to be burned to ashes, he and everything he has, because he has violated the covenant of Yudevave and has committed a shameful deed in Israel. So Israel is expected to destroy and to burn up with fire the person who has done this. So Joshua got up early in the morning and had Israel come forward, one tribe at a time, and the tribe of Yehudah was taken. Had the families of Yehudah come forward, and they took the family of Zarchi. Had the Zarchi family come forward and by household leaders, and Zavdi was taken. He had his household come forward, one person at a time, and Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zavdi, the son of Zerach, of the tribe of Yehudah, was taken. Joshua said to Achan, my son, swear to Yudhevave, the Elohim of Israel, that you will tell the truth and confess to him. Tell me now, what did you do? Don't hide anything from me. Achan answered Joshua, it's true, I have sinned against Yudhevave, the Elohim of Israel. Here is exactly what I did. When I saw there with the spoil a beautiful robe from Shinar, 5 pounds of silver shekel and a 1 pound, quarter-pound wedge of gold. I really wanted them, so I took them. You will find them hidden in the ground inside my tent with the silver underneath. Joshua sent messengers who ran to the tent. It was all there, hidden in his tent, including the silver underneath. They took the things from inside the tent, brought them to Joshua and all the people of Israel, and put them down before Yudhevave. Joshua with all Israel took Achan the son of Zerach with the silver, the robe, the gold wedge, his sons, his daughters, his cattle, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and everything he had, and brought them up to the Achor valley. And Joshua said, why have you brought trouble on us? Today Yudhevave will bring trouble over you, and over him they piled a great mound of stones, which is there to this day. Finally, Yudhevave turned away from his fierce anger, and this is why they called that place the Valley of Achor, trouble, to this day. So they stoned them, and then they burnt them. And the Valley of Achor later on is called the Door of Hope. This actually shows you that when Israel eradicates sin amongst them, then that becomes the door of hope. And this is a rather scary idea, that it is for Israel to remove the sin from amongst them and then to become, that then becomes the door of hope. Was for Gideon. The angel of Yudhevave appeared to him and said, you valiant hero, Yudhevave is with you. Excuse me, sir, answered Gideon, but if Yudhevave is with us, then why is all this happening to us? And where are all these miracles our ancestors told us about when they said, didn't Yudhevave bring us up from Egypt? For now Yudhevave has abandoned us and handed us over to Midian. Yudhevave turned to him and said, go in this strength of yours and save Israel from the hands of Midian. Haven't I sent you? But Gideon answered him, forgive me, my Lord, but with what am I to save Israel? Why, my family is the poorest in Manasseh, and I'm the youngest person in my father's house. Yudhevave said to him, because I will be with you, you will strike down Midian as easily as if they were just one man. Just look again. The angel of Yudhevave appears, and then Yudhevave speaks. Because verse 15, Yudhevave turned to him and said, go in this strength of yours. First he says, you valiant hero, and obviously Gideon was not of the same opinion. He thought that he was just another guy. And then Yudhevave says, go in this strength of yours. And you know what strength Gideon has, because he says, where are all your miracles? Yeah, you're not doing anything for us. How can we possibly? There's no way that we can come up against these Midianites. So won't you please do something about this? And then Yudevave says, haven't I sent you? And then he says, forgive me, my Lord, but what am I? And then he says, I'm the least. And Yudevave says to him, because I am with you, I will take this strength of yours, which is nothing, and I will save Israel, because I am the angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. I am the one who saves. My name is Salvation of Israel. I will save Israel. So I am Yeshua, and I am to save you, he says, without saying it. Gideon replied, if indeed you favor me, would you mind giving me a sign that is really you talking with me? Please don't leave until I go and return with a gift and present it to you. He replied, I will wait till you come back. Gideon went, cooked a young goat, made matzot, unleavened bread again from a bushel of flour. He put the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot, brought them out to under the pistachio tree and presented them. The angel of Yudevave of Elohim said to him, take the meat and the matzot, lay them on the rock, and pour out the broth. Gideon did so. So he takes a young goat, again a lamb, and matzah. So what is he doing? He's presenting Passover to the Lord here. A young goat and matzot. And he's giving it as a gift to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. But he doesn't bring fire with him. So Yudevave says, take the meat and the unleavened bread, the sinlessness, the faith with no addition, and lay them on this rock and pour out the broth. So do a little bit like Eliyahu. How is this going to, like Elijah? Eliyahu, after all, means Yudevave is God. So he pours this broth onto the meat, and ostensibly it should not burn. So he probably stands a little while away. Then the angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh reached out with the staff he was holding, touched the meat and the matzot, and fire shot up out of the rock and burnt up the meat and matzot. When the angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh disappeared before his eyes, Gideon realized that he was the angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and says, oh no, my Lord Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, because I've seen the angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh face to face. But Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh reassured him, shalom to you, don't be afraid, you won't die. The angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh reached out with the stick he was holding, with his staff, with his character, which was totally sinless because he is God himself. He touches the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire shoots up out of the rock and consumes the meat, consumes the flesh and the unleavened bread, the so-called unleavened bread, which is what we are, because we continue to sin, and burns it up completely. And then he disappears. And then he is in fear. But Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh assures him and says, shalom to you. Now, shalom to you, Hebrew, shalom aleichem. When Yeshua greets his disciples, he says, peace to you, shalom aleichem. The angel of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh speaking to them, shalom aleichem. Don't be afraid, you will not die, you will have everlasting life. The only way that sin can be destroyed is if God does it himself. So therefore, righteousness and sinlessness could never have been earned. He gave it to people as a free gift. When the men of the city got up the next morning, there was the altar of Baal destroyed, the sacred pole cut down, and the second bull, a burnt offering on the newly built altar. They asked each other who could have done this. But after investigation, they concluded that Gideon, the son of Joash, had done it. Bring out your son, the men of the city demanded of Joash, so that he may die, because he destroyed the altar of Baal and cut down the sacred pole next to it. But Joash said to all those crowding around him, "You're defending Baal, are you? It's your job to save him. Anyone who defends Baal will be put to death before morning. If he's a Elohim, let him defend himself. After all, someone destroyed his altar." Therefore, on that day, Gideon was given the name Jerubbaal, let Baal defend, because they said, let Baal defend himself against him, since he destroyed his altar. So as a result of what Gideon had experienced, he destroyed the idolatry, because it was the idolatry that made it impossible for Israel to stand against the Moabites. And therefore, this is what he then did in the name of the Lord. So what this actually shows is that Gideon went, the Lord spoke to him and showed him what had to happen, and then he realized the problem of Israel, and he went and sorted out the problem. Now let's look at the inauguration of the temple. When Shlomo had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of Yudhevaveh filled the house, so that the Kohanim, the priests, could not enter the house of Yudhevaveh, because the glory of Yudhevaveh filled Yudhevaveh's house. All the people of Israel saw when the fire came down, and the glory of Yudhevaveh was on the house. They bowed down with their faces to the ground on the flooring, prostrating themselves. They gave thanks to Yudhevaveh for his good, for his grace continues forever. Once again, the fire falls on the flesh and destroys the flesh, but this also initiates the fire that it destroy all of the offerings that come to the temple. And that actually again is saying that it is Yudhevaveh who destroys the flesh. Elijah stepped forward before all the people and said, "How long are you to jump back and forth between two positions? If Yudhevaveh is Elohim, follow him, but if it's Baal, follow him." The people answered him not a word. Then Eliyahu said to the people, I alone am the only prophet of Yudhevaveh who is left, while Baal's prophets number 450. Let them give us 2 young bulls, and they can choose the bull they want for themselves, and let them cut it in pieces and lay it on the wood and put no fire under it, and I will prepare the other bull, lay it on the wood and put no fire under it. So he's saying, let's see who's God. And he's saying, stop vacillating. Because what is happening here is Israel is vacillating between Baal and Yudhevaveh, and he says, choose Yudhevaveh, otherwise you are going to be in trouble. Then he says to them, then you call on the name of your Elohim, and I will call on the name of Yudhevaveh, and the Elohim who answers with fire, let him be Elohim. And all the people answered, good idea, agreed. Then Eliyahu said to the prophets of Baal, choose one bull for yourselves and prepare it first, because there are many of you. Then call on the name of your Elohim and put no fire under it. So he's already saying, if Elohim is God, he will give fire. But note, Elohim does not mean the only true God. All of the false gods are also Elohim, and Elohim is actually the plural of Eloha, which is a God. So he said to them, call, and then we'll see who God is. The God who is God will give fire. They took the bull that was given to them, prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, but no voice was heard, and no one answered. And they jumped around on the altar they had made. Around noon, Eliyahu began ridiculing them. Shout louder, after all, he's Elohim, isn't he? Maybe he's daydreaming, or maybe he's on the potty, or he's away on a trip. Maybe he's asleep, and you have to wake him up. And then Eliyahu said to all the people, come here to me. All the people came up to him as he set about repairing the altar of Yudevave that had been broken down. Eliyahu took 12 stones in keeping with the number of the tribes of the sons of Yaakov, to whom the word of Yudevave had come, saying, your name is to be Israel. With the stones he built an altar in the name of Yudevave. Then he dug a trench around the altar large enough for half a bushel of grain. Interesting things. 12 stones for the 12 tribes, the sons of Yaakov. Yaakov, the cheat, the ankle grabber, the condition that Israel was in, to whom the word of Yudevave had come, saying, your name is to be Israel. Israel, he who rules as El. In other words, Prince of God. And over what does God rule? He rules over sin, because he does not tolerate it. And therefore Israel is meant to rule over sin. And he says, you have been called to rule over sin, but you are Yaakov. And then he built this altar, and he dug a trench around the altar large enough for quite a bit of grain, so that he could eventually pour water. He arranged the wood, cut up the bull, and laid it on the wood. Then he said, fill 4 pots with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. They did it. Do it again, he said, and they did it again. Do it a third time, he said, and they did it a third time. By now the water was flowing around the altar. It had filled the trench. Then when it came time for offering the evening offering, Eliyahu the prophet approached and said, Yudevave, Elohim of Avram, Yitzchak, and Israel, let it be known today that you are Elohim in Israel, and I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Hear me, Yudevave, hear me, so that this people may know that you, Yudevave, are Elohim, and that you are turning their hearts back to you. Then the fire of Yudevave fell. It consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and it licked up all the water in the trench. See what it does here. It licks up the burnt offering, so it consumes the flesh. But then it consumes the stones. In other words, it consumes Israel's flesh completely, because the 12 stones represent the 12 tribes of Jacob, so that they will become Israel, and it licked up the water in the trench. And then the final time, the festival of Shavuoth arrived, Pentecost in Acts 2, and the believers all gathered together in one place. Suddenly there came a sound from the sky like the roar of a violent wind. Remember, a loud shofar. So there was a loud sound, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Then they saw tongues, what looked like fire, which separated and came to rest on each of them. So there are tongues of fire. There was fire on the mountain. Again, the tongues of fire fell to do what? To consume the flesh. And they were all filled with Ruach Ha'Kodesh and began to talk in different languages as the Ruach enabled them to speak, each so that all of them heard. Now this is the outpouring of the Spirit. But let's go and look. This was on Shavuoth. And it is also said that when the Torah was first received on the mountain, it also was Shavuot. It also was Pentecost. On the morning of the third day, thunder, lightning, and a thick cloud. Again fire, the tongues of fire. Then a shofar blast, a loud sound. And Moshe brought the people out of the camp to meet Elohim. They stood near the base of the mountain. Mount Sinai was enveloped in smoke because Yudevaveh descended onto it in fire, tongues of fire. Its smoke went up like the smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain shook violently. There was an earthquake. There was an earthquake. And the sound of the shofar grew louder and louder. Moshe spoke, and Elohim answered him with a voice. So this is what happened on Pentecost again. Moshe went up onto the mountain. The cloud covered the mountain. The glory of Yudevaveh stayed on Mount Sinai. The cloud covered it for 6 days. On the 7th day, he called to Moshe out of the cloud. To the people of Israel, the glory of Yudevaveh looked like a raging fire on the top of the mountain, on top of each head. Moshe entered the cloud, went up on the mountain. He was in the mountain 40 days and nights. So again, the fire falls. Again, to do what? To consume the flesh, to get rid of the flesh.